I always say this, the biggest problem with real estate is the problem of time. That's the problem you buy when you buy real estate. You buy that problem. You've got to solve that by going the distance. Welcome to the Urban Property Investor. I'm your host, Sam Saggers, here to help you crack the code of real estate wealth. Today's show, we're going to dig into some of the methods of buying inside Australian real estate. And this episode has come courtesy of Talia, who has put in a special request. So if you want a special episode dedicated to you, if you've got some questions about real estate, some things you want answered, feel free to DM me and I'll do my best to get to the episode. When I record episodes, I'm usually about 3 to 4 weeks ahead just so I don't fall behind. So it does take me a little bit of time to collaborate with myself and get the episode to air. So Talia, I know you messaged me about a month ago, but hopefully this episode starts to help you with what you need to know. Maybe you've run out and bought a property at auction already and the episode's in arrears for you, but hey, it's time to talk property. Welcome back, Urban Property Investor listeners, regulars. Thank you for tuning in. I hope your world is as good as mine. I feel really happy at the moment. So I'm hoping your happiness levels are as high as mine. And of course, if it's your first time tuning into the show, play the program in double speed, get your life back, get used to my voice so you can speed me up and play it. And all the episodes I've done are lessons on real estate. So feel free to go back in time. Wow, now we've got all of that out of the way. Let's have a good old-fashioned chat about going through a buying process and, of course, getting out there and finding a property that might suit your needs. And, of course, understanding a little bit about the contract world when it comes to real estate. Contract law, does that sound riveting? I tell you what, I'm a big fan of contract law. I like the idea that terms and conditions and methods of sale can absolutely find you a bit of a bargain in the real estate marketplace. In my business, I actually employ a full-time contract law expert, basically a lawyer who understands contract law, so that when I find real estate deals, I can go through the negotiation of those deals fast and also work with someone who understands what I want to get done and negotiate. And so it's probably a little bit of a blessing for certainly me and my business to have her on board. The lovely Lila is, we call her the German train station. She gets things done. She's such a contract law expert. So no matter how we're buying real estate, I've sort of got someone in my core team to deliver sort of that contract expertise. So I really value it. I value it so much. I basically, as a professional investor, have someone by my side to assist me in that space. But of course, for many investors, they're on their own. And I think one of the big lessons here is to build a core team, a core set of professionals that can help you navigate through the minefield, which is Australian real estate. At a bare minimum, you want a great lawyer and you want a great mortgage broker when it comes to playing the game of real estate. Certainly when it comes to the methods of buying out in the marketplace when it comes to choosing property. So I think before you sort of examine, I guess, the methods of sale in Australian real estate, we need to make sure that a property is fit for purpose, and there needs to be really fit for purpose due diligence when it comes to choosing real estate. Now, I've always got some rules around making sure you choose the right property. First, I think, make sure the property's an evidence-based asset. In other words, it's in a location or a marketplace that is proven from a perspective that we know people want to live there. We know ultimately people will want to pay more for housing over time. What we don't want is to negotiate a method of purchase on a deal which is really speculative. So just keep it simple. That's really my number one rule. And of course, I think you need to choose real estate if you're a hold investor that is going to go the distance and marry up to your retirement space. So obviously, you need to sort of weigh up, if it's an older property, at what point do you need to inject capital improvements? And will you be able to borrow money at the point you need to inject capital improvements? Let's say you're 45 years of age, really the property is in reasonable condition, but doesn't need a renovation until maybe you're 65 years of age. Well, then you need to work out what that could look like, because you're going to have to pull out money, most likely, to inject into the asset. So I'm a big believer in choosing assets which probably won't interrupt your hold period for a very long time. If we can get 30, 40 years out of an asset without doing much more than new paint or carpet, ticks a lot of boxes in my book. So I really like things easy to manage. I don't ultimately want projects following me into retirement. I don't mind a project now, but I don't necessarily want a project later. It's just the way I approach being kind to my future self. And I think it's important to have a relationship with your future self when it comes to property investing. Of course, I think the type of asset you go off and buy needs to be in your circle of confidence. I think if you, can just keep it simple, good areas, nice asset typology, something easy to look after. Most people have a long-term relationship with real estate. Where people have a short-term relationship with real estate, they don't know the area they've bought very well. They are uncomfortable from day one. They often feel pressured to do something to keep up with the Joneses. And really, as soon as the maths comes in and they don't understand the mathematics of the real estate, they tend to have a short-lived relationship, certainly as a property investor, less so as a home buyer. Of course, home buyers buy on, emotional logic and, really choose real estate based on, where they want to live, how far they want to be from the shops, where they want the kids to go to school, which is really something that property investors can learn from as well. And of course, if you buy a problem with real estate, you need to solve it. That's the job. That's the trade-off of property investment. I always say this, the biggest problem with real estate is the problem of time. That's the problem you buy when you buy real estate. You buy that problem. You've got to solve that by going the distance. There's other problems you may need to solve when it comes to buying a property. Could be the state of repair of the real estate. It could be some impositions on the property which you need to work through. And that's the game. That's the game. Quite often, making money out of real estate is about finding a bit of a rough diamond, whether it's going to gentrify, whether you're going to renovate it, whether you can, buy modern and sit tight. It's all about solving problems. So I think, a little bit contradictory to that is if it's simple to understand, I think it's an important thing to do. But you've just got to recognize you have to buy something simple to understand that's going to have trade-offs and problems with it, which you need to solve. That's really the game of investment. If investment was easy, everyone would do it, and not everyone does do it. I know here in Australia, the ownership rate for a first and only investment property is high, but it diminishes dramatically into someone owning actually 2 investments or 3 investments and 4 investments. Now, arguably, if you are becoming a property investor, it's probably important to make sure that your core team is understanding that you're trying to build a property portfolio, because your first purchase is quite often the most important one when it comes to property investment. You want to make sure that you can circle back and even invest further down the track. So before we even get into the method of sale, we've got a lot of fit for purpose rules to do. We've got to work out, is it a growth property? Is the market cycle feasible for growth? Is it a property which can produce cash flow? Is it a profiled property which will see rents grow on the asset, which will improve your income position as you grow older? And obviously, is the property worth the purchase price that you're endeavoring to pay? So there's a lot of research to be done before you even get to the point of understanding the method of sale. And of course, for me, fit for purpose real estate is also real estate. If something goes wrong in my life, I know I can sell it. I don't want illiquid real estate. I have the lashes on the back of owning illiquid real estate over the years. When I needed to sell it, I couldn't sell it in 60 days. It took literally a year and a half to sell. That is not the type of real estate you want to own. And I guess a big part of my journey is simply sharing information these days. And a lot of what I share is just some of the mistakes I've made, to be brutally honest. And I don't wish upon someone else to go off and make. And of course, if we're going to choose real estate, if we can find intrinsic value, built-in value, that helps the cause, because it'll help us get off to the best start as a property owner. And of course, I think what is really, really important is pricing. You know, we want obviously sensible pricing for what we go off and buy, particularly linking it to where the cycle is at. And again, if you start to monitor, you know, how much growth has been in a market, and when you're entering the market and where prices are at, you can get a sensitivity check on what you may be doing by becoming an investor. Certainly helps identify where things are at the point of sale, which is the point of purchase for you, the investor. So there's things to do. Asset identification, big part of the job. Needs assessment for you, the investor, what you're trying to do, the defined duration period you're planning on being an investor, the types of strategies you're comfortable doing, the types of purchases you're comfortable getting involved in, the types of growth strategies you are going to implement. Now, I just pass on my growth strategy to as many people as I can. Everyone knows it on this program. It's the 4X growth plan, which I think is the best plan in real estate because it speeds things up. Buy well, choose a good location, choose a marketplace which is going in the right direction, and find a differentiator that is going to make the real estate stand out and get capital growth. So we need to make sure that we're doing this fit for purpose checklist so that we're buying the right property when it comes to real estate. We don't want to be what I would call, you know, a tier 3 buyer. Tier 3 buyers are maniacs. They tend to buy either off fear or fear of missing out. They tend to take a stab in the dark when they go to a home inspection. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes I go to weekend home inspections just to analyze the humans in the crowd, just to see who's out there actually buying real estate. And it's pretty mind-blowing, really, when you go through some of the open homes. Like, most people really are just like, a deer in headlights. They are like wide-eyed, don't know what to look for. Got this one-page brochure about nothing in their hand. They're pressured to see the real estate in a very, very quick period of time. Like, think about going to an open home. Most people are probably there for 10 minutes. And I don't know, I recently actually bought a suit in a tailor's, studio, and I was probably there an hour. So officially, I think it takes longer to buy a suit than it does to often buy a property, which people spend 10 minutes walking through. And so I think it's very, very important to understand that that is like tier 3 exposure to real estate. That is effectively novice buying patterns. It's really what the general market will do. Then they really cross their fingers and hope for their best. So a lot of the market will buy on enthusiasm rather than any sort of formal process, any sort of economic logic, any sort of real major due diligence, and gut feel really is the main driver of how people buy real estate. So don't be one of those people. Get yourself a bit of a due diligence checklist before you start to even get to the point of assessing the methods of sale in real estate. You obviously want to do economic research. You want to do research on the asset that you want to put your foot on. And you want to become a bit of an expert in pricing when it comes to what things are actually worth. So you can make sure that you want to proceed with even entertaining buying the property. Now, a lot of this comes at a cost, and due diligence can be both quantitative and qualitative. I'm a big believer of using both. Qualitative is sort of the rules of thumb. Rule of thumb is a nice street in a nice neighborhood, typically going to do pretty well. Quantitative research is more detailed reports, finding out, the land size, surveys, mapping, researching what the property once was purchased for, external consultations, building and pest inspections, valuations from registered valuers. So all of that is part of the process of buying. And of course, because real estate is time bound, quite often doing extensive due diligence and dealing with a time-bound product is a very difficult thing to do. And of course, real estate agents are experts at making people buy quickly. Quite often it's very common to have very short open home timeframes. So, real estate agents don't open a home for inspection for 9 hours and allow people to come at their leisure and take a good hour to look through a home. They get it, make it like a 25-minute open, 15-minute open, 30-minute open. Make as many people come to the open for inspection as possible, and make them feel uncomfortable that so many other people are at the open inspection. And of course, keep the data reveal of the real estate to a very minimum. That's why you will get a one-page brochure with typically the rates, strata fees, maybe if it's a strata building, maybe not even a price. That's typically what you get, little photograph that's been photoshopped, and that's it. That's your brochure. Now, obviously, there can be a lot more done. And, I know in my business, when I examine a property, I put a 45-page report on the real estate. And most real estate professionals, strategists, advisors, buyers agents, that's what they do. They really work out in detail what an asset can do and where it can go and what are the pros and cons with the real estate. And, for a lot of novice property investors that are sort of doing it themselves, they don't get the flood report done. They don't get the zoning report done. They don't look on Cordell's to see what's being developed in the neighborhood that could impact property values. They just don't have access to that. So the method is gut feel, 10 minutes at an open home, and then get into it. So contract law is a big part of Australian real estate. Real estate is governed here in Australia by the states and territories, and as such, each state and territory has a different version of contract law which pertains to how to go and buy Australian real estate. And of course, each state and territory effectively have different title systems as well. For example, in Canberra, you typically have 99-year leases of perpetuity, which by way of purchase is a leasehold investment. In New South Wales, you have Torrens title properties. In other words, the title is basically not a lease. It is owned by the eventual owner of the property, someone who pays off the mortgage costs. And so you can go out with cash and buy a property and you own the title in New South Wales. Very similar in Victoria and Queensland, but there are different names across the different states when it comes to the actual title system of ownership. Now, the title deeds these days, once upon a time you used to get title deeds and you can put them on the wall, and those title deeds, anyone who had them in their hand used to be able to claim, effectively that they are the rightful owner of the property. And so now there's more digital title deeds, which tends to freak a lot of people out because, I guess conspiracy of real ownership, who really owns the real estate. So we won't go down that path, but contract law's a great thing. I think it's awesome. I think, Australian real estate is complex. There's complex things on properties. There's easements, covenants. There's impositions on properties. There's dividing boundaries. There's frontages on real estate. So there's a lot to go through, and there are things that can impact the value of real estate. Things like right-of-ways or easements, which ultimately, as part of your research, you need to be able to look into deeper to see if a real estate has a imposition on it. So generally, and different states have different kind of playbooks. So houses, generally, if they're in a state, will have their own freehold title. In New South Wales, which I'm most acquainted with, it's Torrens title. That means property ownership. It means really it's freehold, so there's no ongoing quarterly fees. It means you're not sharing any common property with someone else, and you can really determine what you want to do with the real estate and when you want to do it. There is a form of community title which links to basically freehold or torrents title. Now, community title is effectively whereby a home might be built in a community scheme, but really there is no strata fees, but there is sort of an annual fee to do private road landscaping. So quite often you see in private gated communities, which I think are great investment areas, they are freehold properties with a community scheme. And so they might have a limitation of the different like full strata costs, but they will have a per annum cost to do landscaping, which is great because I actually think it's the best model because you get good street appeal because everyone's paying for the street to look better and manicured. Quite often you see that sort of form of ownership in just sort of little private communities, little infill communities quite often. And of course, there is basically strata title properties, which we would all be familiar with, apartments, units, townhouses that basically are part of a ongoing community ownership. So not only do you own the property, but you own a proportion of the overall site, if you like. And so I own some strata title properties and, I own a percentage of the car park and I own a percentage of the swimming pool. I own a percentage of the rooftop and I own a percentage of, the overall land content. And so really, obviously, with strata title properties, there are sort of rules and obligations, bylaws, and of course, because you're sharing with other people, you obviously want to make sure that the scheme is well looked after. And so one of the big, I guess, due diligence steps is making sure you do a bit of a title search and a vendor check, and if you are buying in a existing strata scheme, a strata search. Now, in New South Wales, it's very common to do this before you even go to make an offer on property or you go to the auction. So in New South Wales, it's very quite often not expensive, but there is costs involved before you even make an offer on property. It's very common to get a building and pest inspection done. That could be $400. Get a contract reviewed, just a quick sort of read of the contract might be a couple $100 for that. Then a strata search, which could be a couple $100 more. So you could be in it for about $1,000, $1,500 before you even go to the auction or make the offer on the property. And quite often in New South Wales, it's not common to get subject terms that allow you finance building and pest, which is quite annoying for New South Wales purchasers. And so quite often you hear of what is known as gazumping in New South Wales, whereby you kind of have a verbal offer with the agent. Hey, mate, yep, I'm willing to pay $1 million. Yep, the vendor will take it. Then you go off and get your building, pest and finance done, but you're not in contract. And then someone comes along and pays $1,020,000 and you've spent all that money and you've got nowhere. So one of my mates recently bought a property and he did this about 17 times, literally spent so much money just going through the checks and balances process, but eventually bought a very, very good property. And, it's important to do this stuff as well. If you are working in other states and territories, particularly Queensland and also Victoria, you can get subject terms. And so the problem with, say, Queensland, though, in their contract law process, they don't have disclosures in their contracts. So, typically in New South Wales, you'll get a water and sewerage diagram or a zoning certificate disclosed in your contract. In Queensland, a little bit different. So you've got to be able to have a good contract team to help you unlock all of these imminent issues with the real estate. And so, just different horses for different courses. Hence why I have a full-time lawyer in my team, because, it's interesting, the different rules and obligations. And she spent a lifetime learning different contract law in different states. The challenge is if you live in New South Wales and you have a New South Wales lawyer and you're buying a property in Queensland, they may not understand actually even Queensland law. So quite often people will become specialists in certain areas. So you need to just make sure that even your core team understands the different states and different regulations. I've certainly had frustratingly put together some cracking deals, and then a buyer sort of brought a lawyer from the wrong state to the party as part of their core team, and literally rather than just put up his hand and say, hey, look, I can't really do this, this is not my wheelhouse, sort of crashed the deal. So sometimes lawyers as well crash deals because rather than say, hey, look, I can't do this, and sort of go up the street and speak to a guy who can, a girl who can. So obviously contracts exist, and the amount of people that don't read a contract is quite alarming. And today with DocuSign, obviously you just click buttons and you buy a property. And so make sure you actually spend the time to read a contract so that you're understanding the next phase of what you may be doing. So contracts are available. Real estate agents will issue contracts. Now, in Queensland, typically you buy under what is known as offer and acceptance. So the contract is very, very minor. It doesn't have a lot of disclosures in it. It doesn't have any. It's just basically a piece of paper, and you make an offer, 400,000, and then the vendor comes back 450, and then you go back 500, and then they come back 550, and you go back 575, and eventually a deal is done. And really what's happening in Queensland, quite often the real estate agents, if they have multiple offers, they're doing that everywhere. And eventually you get to a point where offer and acceptance wise, you eventually can buy something. But there are kind of four methods of sale in Australia, which are very common: auction, private treaty, expression of interest, and tender. Private treaty is just effectively the vendor has instructed their real estate agent to encourage competitive offers. Now, in New South Wales, those competitive offers, again, don't necessarily form part of a written contract. They tend to be verbal or written. In Queensland, they go into offer and acceptance. So you tend to basically, as I just described, put an offer actually on the contract, which is counter offered on the contract, and eventually a deal gets done. And really, I guess, that method, if you like, really is a good method of purchase, very common method of purchase here in Australia. it kind of allows for a little bit more time for negotiation for the best price. It's not, it's not done instantly because both parties are sort of moving and eventually getting a deal done. For the vendor, though, probably one of the cons is quite often the buyer doesn't feel as rushed. So it may take longer compared to, for example, an auction, which is set at a particular time. And obviously the risk for a buyer is they overpay and, they don't see what other people are offering and start to get nervous in their head and start to effectively negotiate with themselves and overpay. I remember being with a client in a real estate agent's office, buying a property in Collingwood, and that was in Victoria. And again, we were there creating verbal offers. The agent would leave the room, go and ring the vendor. They would come back, and my client at the time was effectively just upping the ante on herself. In the end, after she'd done this twice, I had to sort of pause the mediation and have a chat with her and say, look, the agent here may not actually have another buyer, and you're effectively now upping the price on yourself. And it's very common in private treaty for buyers to end up doing that. And so eventually her emotions slowed back, and she sort of just stuck to that price, ended up getting a fair price and a pretty good little asset. So auctions are also a big part of Australian society, particularly in New South Wales, in Sydney and in Melbourne. It's very common for real estate agents to take real estate to auction. And auction is an interesting thing because auction markets, real estate agents don't auction real estate if there's low levels of demand. So the fact that an auction is happening is usually a pretty good signal that the real estate is a high demand asset. And obviously in auctions, one of the advantages of auctions is it is a open marketplace. Everyone can see what everyone's doing. There's no behind the scene deals. It's there to be seen by everyone. And obviously auctions allow the highest bidder to walk away with the property. Now, for a real estate agent, auctions are a 3-phase campaign. They actually are looking for people to effectively buy before auction, at auction, and if the auction actually fails, they've still got up their sleeve the after auction negotiation. If the property passes in, they can sort of look and see who was at the auction and start to negotiate from a private treaty point of view with those people. So really, auction is almost a component of private treaty with a day of mayhem that emotionally drives the price up and that everyone can see what's going on. So it's quite often for people to see a property and see if they can just take it out before auction. It's one of the tools a buyer has up their sleeve. And quite often if they're, pretty competitive with their offer, they can really get the vendor thinking, well, do we just crash the auction because this offer is pretty good? And generally, you know, as a buyer, you can sort of say, look, I'm looking at a couple of properties and I'm happy to get a deal done on this particular deal. I'm happy to strike a deal pre-auction. But if it does go to auction, I just want the vendor to know, you know, I probably won't be there because I am negotiating through other deals at the moment. So you're kind of sowing the seeds of doubt for the agent and the vendor. But equally, for a sales agent, they can start to see where the prices, the gauge of interest is at, because they may be getting a few people doing the same thing. Now, obviously, auctions allow for competitive bidding to drive up the sales price. And there's no guarantee that a property will sell at auction. Of course, this allows for a real estate agent to have that third phase, which is after auction negotiations. But if you are buying at public auction, firstly, most states these days, you have to register as a bidder. And you then are liable for what happens through your bids. And of course, what you do need to know if you do buy at auction is you are unconditional. There is no cooling off period. There is no period of time where you are then going, well, I actually don't have finance, or I, you know, haven't done my building and pest inspection. So you waive your rights to cool off at public auction. Now, generally, depending on the state, there is a cooling off provision for real estate that is also often waived through private treaty. Real estate agents will often say the strength of your offer is higher if you waive any cooling off period. And generally, there's sort of about a 5-day cooling off period on contracts around Australia. It does buffer around, so make sure you double check that. But depending on what state you're looking at, but effectively, you know, cooling off provisions can be waived from contracts. And real estate agents are very good at saying, well, you know, your offer's good. I've got something similar. If you waive your cooling off, you know, the vendor will take the deal. That means you're unconditional. That means you literally have no rights and obligations to get out of the contract. Now, typically, to buy a property, agents are looking for around a 10% deposit to hold. And at auction, that is also effectively what you would pay. You would need to have that money available on the day of auction to effectively put your foot on the property, and then you go through a settlement process. And settlement, depending on the state and territory, can be anywhere from 30 to 42 days. It is what it is. But again, when you do buy at auction, understand as well, if you pay too much, quite often valuations may be a challenge thereafter. Quite often the valuer even consider the underbidder as to what they paid, as to what the market is prepared to pay for the property when it comes to the true value of the real estate. They see the underbidder quite often as the benchmark of where the market's at, and you bought effectively above where the market's at. Otherwise, someone else would have stepped up to that point. So obviously they have to use comparable sales data. It's quite often, you know, recent sales of a similar property to justify the price. Hopefully you've done your pricing research so you don't put yourself in a position where you pay way too much for the property. So again, you can jag a deal at auction, and for a lot of people, they get caught up in the emotions of the auction and can actually do themselves a bit of a disservice by paying a little bit too much for the property. Obviously, if there's a lot of demand for the property, there's going to be a lot of bidders at the auction. And of course, there's, quite often a lot of movement around what that could look like. Now, there's some great books on how to buy at auction. So I think, if you want to study, the types of angles to use at auction, maybe go into a bit more thorough deep dive on it, the knockout blow, offer, the silent bidder, all that kind of stuff. There's a little bit of, I guess, psychology behind it, but for the most part today, we're just sort of talking about how it all kind of slots in together. Now, there is other methods of sale. One which I tend to get my investors to use is an expression of interest. Expression of interest effectively just basically says, I'm interested in this property. Here's a little bit of money and my details, and I would like to see a contract, and I would like to get some terms and conditions of purchasing. So an expression of interest really allows for a buyer to submit their offer without necessarily having done the full due diligence on a property. So it's not a bad way to buy, and I've always found it one of the better ways to buy, because really quite often with property investors, they aren't home buyers. They're not circulating one suburb and know it like the back of their hand. They tend to, look for something in a macro market, then a micro market, and then a local suburb. And so quite often the better way for property investors is what is often referred to as an expression of interest, which basically is a written offer with a name and a small deposit which says I'm serious about going further. And then really on that expression of interest ends up becoming the terms that would form part of the purchase. Things like subject to building pest, finance, valuation, things like, subject to impositions on the property, easement checks. And of course, not all vendors accept expressions of interest, but it is possible to do purchasing that way. And I find, once people get their head around it, it's a nice light way to buy. It's really a document, a basically legal document that says we're going to call a contract. And it's a good way to buy. Sort of the close brother to tender, effectively. Tender is kind of the reverse of the expression of interest, whereby a vendor says everyone express interest, and the highest interest expressed will take out the asset. So sale by tender. It's not so common in really residential. It's very common in commercial and industrial. But again, it generally is done on complex sites whereby a lot of people need time to really understand the asset's ability to produce income down the track. And so quite often a development site, for example, would be sold by virtue of tender. So they're kind of the different methods of sale. And of course, when it comes to making sure you're mission fit for a contract, you really need to know what name you're going to put on a contract. And I see a lot of people struggle with this one, hence why I use expression of interest a lot. Is actually a lot of people put themselves in a position to buy real estate, but then actually when it comes to the crunch, haven't got their structures set up, or they, aren't quite sure if they're buying it with their spouse, or they're just putting it in their own name, or they're superannuation buyers, and they haven't actually set up their bear trust. So the expression of interest is quite a good model because it allows certainly for the safeguarding approach of like, hey, you know, you put your name down for this particular asset, but your actual entity is wrong. So I think there's some work to be done there. So it's a good fail-safe, I find, when it comes to buying real estate. So, you know, if there's more than one person buying the property, that needs to be organized as well when you sign the contract. You know, at the end of the day, married couples tend to buy as joint tenants, which means if one party is to die, the real estate just instantly transfers to the next party. But if you are buying as a structure where you want sort of a percentage-based ownership, maybe you're buying with someone, your spouse or your friend or your sister or whatever it may be, you would use tenants in common, which is effectively you can identify the split, 50-50 split, 80-20 split, whatever the split effectively is, you can proportion it out to the entity buying. And so, you know, at the end of the day, buying real estate, it's a bit of a learning curve for a lot of people, and hence why today, you know, you've got great advisors, strategists, buyers agents who are quite often used to sort of help navigate this stuff, which in my experience sometimes is very undervalued. Because and quite often, a lot of property investors are kind of, particularly in you know, if they use investment teams, are insulated from a lot of this stuff. This stuff, you know, most buyers agents, you know, like do all this stuff for you, or property strategists or acquisition advisory firms do all this stuff behind the scenes, and you don't really get to witness it. It's only until you go out on your own do you realize just how complicated some of this stuff is. Obviously, you know, you've now signed the contract, you've bought the property at auction, you've bought it at a private treaty. You know, you will start to get things like loan documents sent to you from your funder. You know, those loan documents, quite often you'll be asked to make sure the property is insured before settlement, and you will also be asked to get legal advice on the loan that you're about to enter into. Of course, a lot of people, you know, may waive that legal advice or partake it. It's really up to an individual's circumstances. But eventually the property settles and you take possession of the property. You want to make sure it's insured the day you pick up the keys. And, you know, I'm a big believer on the day you exchange on the property or go unconditional, you start a insurance policy over the building that you have bought, so that you're well and truly covered the minute you own that real estate. So it's very, very important. Now, again, when it comes to different contract law at settlement, things do buffer around different states. In Queensland, up until recently, they had time of the essence, which meant that if your funder and you could not settle at the agreed time on the agreed date, you forfeited your deposit. And a lot of people lost deposits because, for example, their bank was late getting to the party during the COVID boom. Queensland obviously went gangbusters during COVID. There's a lot of buying going on, and banks weren't necessarily keeping up with what was happening. And there were occasions where banks actually were late to settlement. And because the real estate was going up so quickly, the vendors actually pulled the pin on the sale and took the deposit of the purchaser. Queensland government started to go, well, this is a bloody ridiculous law we've created for everyone and we're losing people money. First home buyers, young families just torching dough left, right and centre, that they now have a 5-day extension if you miss settlement, the day of settlement. In New South Wales and Victoria, it's typically always been a notice to complete at settlement. In other words, if you miss settlement, the vendor has to issue you a notice and they have to give you 14 further days to settle, which I think is the fairest system, which is a good system in my viewpoint. Victoria also has, in my viewpoint, one of the best clauses in Australian real estate, which is a nomination clause. And so you can go unconditional on a property and you can obviously settle the property. You can still get a notice to complete to settle the property. However, let's say you were buying a property and you, for some reason, couldn't settle the property in the period of time, 2-month settlement, 3-month settlement, 9-month settlement, and you effectively think, okay, well, maybe I'll do something else. I'll get out of this deal that I'm buying, or I want to do something else, or I want to live somewhere else. Effectively, you can actually nominate the property to someone else if you know someone else who would buy the property. And obviously, that is called a nomination. So you could nominate it to your best mate who's like, yeah, I'll buy that property if you're buying something else. Sounds a bit loose, but it is just an interesting actual contract law term, the nomination clause. And there are it's effectively an instrument for you to pass on the obligation to settle the property to someone else. You don't necessarily pay stamp duty by doing that. It's basically a contract provision that allows the new person to take over the obligation. Should that new purchaser not settle, though, you are by default the obligated person. So there's some settlement facts around real estate. Typically, if you're buying private treaty, expression of interest, which becomes private treaty or tender or auction, you'll get a settlement period, 30 to 42 days. You'll rock up at settlement. You'll settle the property. 90% of things go according to plan. 10% are delayed. You use your notice to complete period. If you are delayed, then you settle, then you own the property, move in, or start to get it rented out. All right, folks, that's it from me. I'll catch you on the next episode as we talk more real estate. Thanks for tuning in to the Urban Property Investor. To never miss an episode, make sure you subscribe to the podcast on your favorite app or on YouTube. I would love it if you could give the show a rating and share it with your friends and family. In between episodes, you can always keep in touch with me by connecting on social media over Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn. Until we meet again on the next episode of the Urban Property Investor, take care and bye for now.